The morning sun blazed over Austin like God's own spotlight, casting long shadows across the governor's mansion. Greg Abbott sat in his wheelchair at the head of the polished oak table, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the document that would change everything. The Supreme Court's ruling lay before him like a gauntlet thrown down on Texas soil. "Governor, they're saying we have no choice," whispered his chief of staff, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "The court's decision is final." Abbott's weathered hands gripped the armrests of his chair. 27 years since that oak tree had changed his life forever. And he'd learned one thing above all else: when you're knocked down, you don't stay down. When they tell you what you can't do, you show them what Texas can do. Final. Abbott's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Son, the only thing final is death and judgment day. And last I checked, the good Lord ain't called me home yet." Outside, the flags of Texas and America snapped in the wind, side by side but not always in agreement. Today, they would test which allegiance ran deeper in the heart of a man who'd sworn to defend both the Constitution and the Lone Star State. The phone rang. Washington was calling. The call came from the highest echelons of power. "Governor Abbott, this is not a request. This is the law of the land." The voice on the other end carried the weight of federal authority. But Greg Abbott had been carrying something heavier. For decades, the expectations of 29 million Texans. He wheeled himself to the window overlooking the Capitol grounds, where tourists snapped photos and children played, blissfully unaware that their future hung in the balance. His mind wandered to that Sunday morning service at First Baptist, where Pastor Williams had preached about David facing Goliath. Sometimes, the pastor had said, his voice booming across the sanctuary, "God calls ordinary men to do extraordinary things, not because they're perfect, but because they're willing to stand when everyone else sits down." Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. Abbott's press secretary knocked and entered, her face pale as morning milk. "Sir, the networks are calling. They want to know our response to the court's deadline." Through the glass, Abbott watched the Texas flag strain against its pole, fighting. The wind but never breaking. His grandfather had fought at the Alamo, not the famous one, but the spiritual one that every Texan carries in their heart. The place where you decide whether to surrender your principles or surrender everything else. "Tell them," Abbott said, his voice steady as bedrock, "that Texas will respond in our own time, in our own way, and remind them that this great state has never bowed to anyone except Almighty God." The die was cast. The showdown was coming. The rain hammered Austin that Tuesday night like bullets on a tin roof. Abbott sat alone in his study, surrounded by law books and framed photos of Texas heroes Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, Ronald Reagan shaking hands with his predecessor. The weight of decision pressed down on him heavier than the storm clouds outside. A knock at the door broke his meditation. Pastor Williams stood there, water dripping from his hat brim, his weathered Bible tucked under his arm like a soldier's rifle. "Thought you might need some company tonight, Governor." Abbott gestured to the chair across from his desk. For 30 years, Williams had shepherded the flock at Austin's oldest Baptist church. He'd buried Abbott's parents, baptized his daughter, and never once asked for a political favor. Tonight, he came as a friend. "They're saying I'm playing with fire, Pastor. That no state can stand against the Supreme Court and survive." Williams opened his Bible, the pages falling naturally to a passage he'd marked long ago. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced a similar choice. "Governor, bow down to the king's golden image or face the furnace. You know what they said." Abbott nodded. He'd grown up on these stories in Sunday school, but tonight they felt fresh as morning dew. "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us," Williams read. "But if not, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up." The old pastor closed the Bible and leaned forward. "Sometimes, Greg, God doesn't call us to win. He calls us to be faithful. Texas needs a man who'll stand in the furnace, whatever the cost." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the study, peace settled like snow on troubled ground. Dawn broke over Texas like a promise kept. Abbott wheeled himself through the corridors of the governor's mansion, past portraits of men who'd faced their own moments of truth. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since midnight. Senators, congressmen, donors, all begging him to reconsider. But it was the other calls that mattered. Sheriff Johnson from Amarillo, Governor, my deputies stand with. Texas, Mayor Rodriguez from El Paso, sir, our city council voted unanimously, we're behind you. And dozens more, from Beaumont to Lubbock, from Houston to San Antonio. His wife found him in the breakfast nook, staring at his untouched coffee. Greg, honey, talk to me. What's eating at you? He reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had held his through months of rehabilitation, through campaigns won and lost, through every storm that had tested their marriage. I keep thinking about our daughter, he said. What kind of Texas are we leaving her? One that stands for something, or one that folds every time Washington raises its voice? She squeezed his fingers. I married a fighter, Greg Abbott. Don't you dare become a quitter now. At 10 o'clock, Abbott rolled into the press room. The cameras clicked like cicadas in summer. Every major network was there. Every newspaper from the New York Times to the Tyler Telegraph. The world was watching. Texas, ladies and gentlemen, Abbott began, his voice carrying the authority of every elected office he'd held. The state of Texas will not comply with yesterday's federal mandate. We believe it violates our state sovereignty and the constitutional rights of our citizens. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions like bullets flying. But Abbott sat steady as a lighthouse in a hurricane, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with armies, but with words that echo through history. The president's call came at exactly 3:17 p.m. Central Time. Abbott had been expecting it since his press conference that morning sent shockwaves from Austin to Washington. His chief of staff knocked twice, their signal for the most sensitive conversations. Greg, this is beyond politics now. The president's voice crackled through the secure line. Carrying 40 years of Washington experience and the weight of the federal government, you're forcing my hand here. Abbott swiveled his chair to face the Texas flag hanging in the corner of his office. His grandfather's cavalry saber hung beneath it, a reminder that Abbott's had been defending Texas soil for generations. Mr. President, with all due respect, you forced my hand first. Texas won't be bullied. Not by Washington, not by the court, not by anyone. Governor, you know what this means. Federal funding, federal programs, federal cooperation, all of it's at risk. Is your pride worth bankrupting your state? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Abbott thought of the families struggling to make ends meet, the hospitals dependent on federal aid, the schools counting on Washington's dollars. But then he thought of something else, the children in those schools, and what they'd think of grown-ups who surrendered their principles for money. Mr. President, my daddy used to say that a man's word is his bond, and a man's principles are his treasure. You can't spend principles at the store, but you can't look at yourself in the mirror without them either. Silence stretched across the miles between Austin and Washington. Finally, the president spoke again, his voice softer but no less serious. Greg, I'm trying to save you from yourself here. Back down now, and we can work something out. Keep pushing, and what, sir? You'll send federal marshals to Texas? Good luck with that. The line went dead. Abbott set down the phone and bowed his head, not in defeat, but in prayer. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought on your knees before they're fought in public. Sunday morning at First Baptist Church felt different. The sanctuary buzzed with tension thick as summer humidity. Abbott wheeled down the center aisle to his usual pew, feeling every eye in the congregation tracking his movement. Some faces showed support, others worry, all showed the weight of what was happening to their Texas. Pastor Williams stepped to the pulpit, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through stained glass windows, depicting the crucifixion and resurrection. He opened his Bible, but his eyes found Abbott first. Folks, we're living through a moment that'll be written about in history books. Our governor has taken a stand that's got the whole nation talking. Some of you support him, some of you're worried sick, and some of you think he's lost his ever-loving mind." Nervous laughter rippled through the pews. "But I want to read you something from the book of Daniel. When King Nebuchadnezzar demanded that everyone bow down to his golden statue, there were 3 young men who said no, not because they wanted to be famous, not because they wanted to cause trouble, but because they knew the difference between God's law and man's law." Abbott felt his wife's hand slip into his, around them. The congregation sat in silence, broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the distant hum of air conditioning. "Now I'm not saying Governor Abbott is Daniel," Williams continued, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. "Lord knows, none of us are perfect. But I am saying that sometimes God calls ordinary people to take extraordinary stands. And when He does, the least we can do is pray for them." After the service, something remarkable happened. One by one, congregation members approached Abbott, not to ask for favors or photo opportunities, but to lay their hands on his shoulders and whisper prayers. Old Mrs. Henderson, who'd taught Sunday school for 50 years, young James Martinez, fresh out of the Marines, the Johnson family, whose boy was fighting overseas, "Governor," whispered Mrs. Henderson, her voice trembling with age and emotion. "You just remember that David was just a shepherd boy when he faced Goliath, but he had something that giant didn't have." "What's that, ma'am?" She patted his shoulder with a hand that had seen 8 decades of Texas history. He knew he wasn't fighting alone. Monday morning came like Judgment Day. The federal marshals arrived at the Texas state capitol at dawn, their black SUVs forming a convoy that stretched down Congress Avenue like a funeral procession. Abbott watched from his office window as they deployed, their movements precise and cold as winter wind. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Federal agents have surrounded the Texas state capitol. Governor Abbott has been ordered to surrender state records and comply with federal oversight. But something else was happening. On the streets below, Texans were coming, not in organized groups or political rallies, but as individuals making individual choices. The retired rancher from Waco, the oil worker from Midland, the school teacher from Tyler. They came in pickup trucks and minivans, carrying folding chairs and American flags, and signs that read "Don't mess with Texas," and "We stand with Abbott." By noon, 10,000 Texans had gathered on the Capitol grounds. By evening, 20,000. They didn't threaten anyone or break any laws. They just stood there, a living wall of Texas pride between the federal agents and their governor. Sheriff Martinez from Bexar County called Abbott's direct line. "Governor, I've got 2,000 deputies ready to respond. Just say the word." Similar calls came from across the state. The Rangers were standing by. The National Guard was on alert. Texas law enforcement was choosing sides, and they were choosing Texas. Abbott rolled out onto the Capitol steps as the sun set behind him, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. The crowd fell silent, 20,000 Texans waiting to hear from the man they'd elected to lead them. "My fellow Texans," Abbott's voice carried across the grounds, amplified by speakers but powered by conviction. "They say we can't stand alone. They say no state can defy the federal government and survive. But I want to remind you of something. We've done it before." The crowd roared its approval, but Abbott raised his hand for silence. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about parties. This is about whether we're still Americans, still free, still able to govern ourselves. And I'm here tonight to tell you that as long as I'm governor of this great state, Texas will never bow to tyranny, no matter what uniform it wears." The deadline came at midnight on Wednesday. Abbott sat in his office, surrounded by his closest advisors, as the clock ticked toward the moment of truth. The federal marshals had given him until 12:01 a.m. to comply with the court's order. At 12:02, they would arrest him for contempt. His chief of staff paced the floor like a caged animal. "Governor, it's not too late. We can still find a compromise, some middle ground." Abbott shook his head. "Son, there's no middle ground. Between freedom and submission, there's no compromise between principle and politics. At some point, you have to choose who you are." The phone rang one last time. It was his daughter, calling from college. "Daddy, I've been watching the news. Are you really going to let them arrest you?" Abbott closed his eyes, remembering the night She was born, how he'd held her tiny hand and promised to always protect her, to leave her a world better than the one he'd inherited. Sweetheart, sometimes the best thing a father can do for his daughter is show her what it looks like, to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything. I love you, Daddy, and I'm proud of you. The line went dead. Abbott looked at the clock, 11:59 p.m. Outside, the crowd had grown to 30,000. They'd been there for 3 days now, sleeping in tents, sharing food, singing hymns, and waiting. The federal agents had surrounded the building, but they hadn't moved. Even they seemed to understand that arresting a governor surrounded by 30,000 of his constituents might not end well. At 12:01 a.m., nothing happened. At 12:02, the silence stretched like a held breath. At 12:03, Abbott's phone rang. It was Washington. Governor Abbott, this is the Attorney General. We need to talk. 3 weeks later, Abbott sat in the Rose Garden of the White House, Texas sunshine streaming through the windows of the Oval Office. The president sat across from him, both men older and wiser than they'd been when this crisis began. You know, Greg, my staff thought I was crazy to invite you here. They said you'd made me look weak, that compromising would hurt me politically. Abbott adjusted his wheelchair, his hands steady on the armrests. Mr. President, with respect, I didn't make you look weak. I made you look like a leader who's willing to listen when the people speak. The compromise they'd reach wasn't perfect, but it was American. The federal mandate would be modified to respect state sovereignty. Texas would comply with the spirit of the law while maintaining its constitutional rights. Most importantly, the principle had been established. States could still stand up to federal overreach without being crushed. The country's watching this, you know, the president said. Other governors are already calling, asking if they can do what you did. Abbott smiled. Mr. President, that's the point. We're not subjects of the federal government. We're partners in this great experiment called America. Sometimes partners have to remind each other of that. Back in Texas, the crowd had finally dispersed from the Capitol grounds, but something had changed in the hearts of Texans. They'd remembered what it felt like to stand for something bigger than themselves. They'd remembered that government serves the people, not the other way around. That Sunday, Pastor Williams preached about the 3 Hebrew boys again, but this time, he added a new ending to the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked into that furnace, and you know what happened. They didn't burn. They didn't even smell like smoke. Because when you stand with God, when you stand for principle, when you stand for what's right, the fire can't touch you. Abbott sat in his pew, holding his wife's hand, listening to the sermon and thinking about the future. His daughter would graduate soon, and someday she'd have children of her own. They'd grow up in a Texas that remembered how to stand tall, how to say no when saying yes would be easier, how to choose principle over politics. The organist began playing Amazing Grace, and 30,000 voices seemed to echo across the years, singing the words that had sustained Texans through every trial, through many dangers, toils and snares. I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Outside, the Texas flag flew high against the endless blue sky, and Greg Abbott knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Texas would face them standing tall, standing together, and standing for the principles that made America great. The day Abbott defied the Supreme Court had become the day Texas remembered who it was.